$500,000 to anyone who can hack this system, Ethan Whitmore announced with an easy smile, letting the challenge echo through the packed convention hall. But save yourself the embarrassment if your only credential is an intern badge. The laughter came fast, confident, and effortless, rolling beneath the towering LED screens that stretched nearly 50 feet across the stage. Cameras swept over hundreds of software engineers, investors, founders, and journalists gathered inside the San Francisco Innovation Summit, the country's most anticipated artificial intelligence event of the year. Blue spotlights danced across polished steel beams while giant displays counted down to what had been advertised as the most secure cybersecurity demonstration ever performed live. At the center of it all stood Ethan Whitmore, 38 years old, billionaire founder of Ether Dynamics, a man whose reputation had become almost as valuable as his company. He built products that reshaped industries, negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions before breakfast, and rarely walked into a room without believing he already owned it. Every magazine praised his confidence. Every competitor feared his ambition. Every employee understood one unwritten rule: Ethan Whitmore never expected to lose. Behind him, a transparent glass server rack glowed beneath crisp white lights like a museum exhibit, connected to a network that his company claimed was impossible to breach. Security specialists watched from elevated control booths while giant monitors displayed rows of encrypted code scrolling faster than most people could read. The audience leaned forward. Some crossed their fingers. Others quietly opened their laptops, hoping for the impossible. Near the back of the auditorium, almost hidden beside a camera platform, sat a young black intern named Nia Brooks. Her company badge looked no different from dozens of others except for the small gray stripe that quietly identified her as temporary staff. Most executives had walked past her all morning without learning her name. She had spent the last 3 months delivering reports, organizing technical documentation, and quietly fixing problems no one realized existed. She rarely spoke during meetings because interns were expected to observe, not interrupt. She preferred it that way. While everyone else admired the stage, Nia watched the architecture behind it. Her eyes traced the server connections, the backup nodes, the authentication sequence, and the timing between each encrypted handshake. Every blinking light felt strangely familiar. Every layer of code displayed on the massive screen stirred memories she had spent years trying to bury. Around her, conversations buzzed with excitement. People whispered about stock prices, venture capital, and whether anyone would dare challenge Ethan's impossible offer. Then, before the countdown clock reached 60 seconds, Nia slowly raised her hand. It was a simple movement, almost invisible inside a room filled with power suits and television cameras. But somehow Ethan noticed. His confident grin widened. He tilted his microphone toward her and chuckled. "You?" he asked, loud enough for every speaker in the auditorium to carry his voice from the front row to the highest balcony. "You think you can hack the system that America's best engineers couldn't even scratch?" Another wave of laughter rolled through the audience. Some smiled politely. Others shook their heads before turning their cameras toward the young intern standing alone beneath the bright lights. Unaware that the quiet woman everyone saw as an inexperienced intern was looking at a system she recognized better than anyone else in the building. The laughter lingered for a few more seconds before fading into a silence filled with quiet amusement. Ethan Whitmore lowered his microphone just enough to flash the confident smile that had helped him close billion-dollar deals across 3 continents. He was certain the moment had already become another entertaining story for social media. Around the auditorium, investors exchanged knowing looks while several engineers folded their arms, convinced the demonstration would be over before it truly began. A young intern challenging the flagship security platform of one of the most influential artificial intelligence companies in America sounded less like a serious attempt and more like an unforgettable punchline. Nia Brooks remained standing. She did not rush toward the stage. She did not defend herself. She did not argue with anyone in the room. Instead, she calmly adjusted the company badge hanging from her neck and waited for the room to settle. Confidence did not always make the loudest entrance. Sometimes it simply refused to leave. The giant countdown clock continued ticking above the stage. 57 seconds. 56. 55. Ethan glanced toward his chief security officer, who answered with an amused shrug. Every vulnerability assessment had been completed. Every penetration test had been verified by outside consultants. Insurance auditors had signed off on the demonstration only 2 weeks earlier. The platform was designed to withstand attacks from government-level threat simulations. There was no realistic scenario where an intern could embarrass the company in front of hundreds of influential guests. Ethan raised the microphone once again. "Come on up," he said with a playful grin. "At the very least, everyone deserves a good show." More laughter drifted through the audience, softer this time, mixed with the clicking of smartphone cameras and the glow of live-stream notifications spreading across social media. Nia walked down the center aisle at an unhurried pace. Her black blazer was simple, her shoes practical, and her laptop showed the faint signs of daily use rather than luxury. She looked nothing like the celebrated engineers seated near the front rows wearing custom suits and expensive watches. Yet there was something unusual about the way she looked at the stage. She did not admire it. She studied it. Her eyes paused for less than a second on every monitor, every cable, every wireless access point hidden beneath the polished presentation. It was almost as though she already knew where everything belonged. A production assistant handed her a wireless keyboard while another employee placed a demonstration laptop on the center podium. Ethan stepped aside with theatrical confidence, extending one arm toward the screen as though introducing a contestant on a game show. "Take your best shot," he said. "If you even find the front door, I will be impressed." Nia rested her fingertips lightly on the keyboard without pressing a single key. Instead, she quietly examined the login screen projected 30 feet high behind her. The familiar arrangement of icons, the subtle spacing between security prompts, even the sequence of encrypted authentication requests triggered memories she had spent years convincing herself to forget. Her heartbeat remained steady, but something behind her calm expression quietly shifted. This was no longer just another demonstration. Somewhere deep beneath layers of polished updates and expensive redesigns, she recognized the fingerprints of an idea she had once believed had disappeared forever. The auditorium became so quiet that even the soft hum of the cooling fans inside the glass server rack seemed louder than before. Hundreds of eyes followed every movement Nia Brooks made, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, expecting the nervous mistakes of someone far outside her depth. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her fingertips resting gently on the keyboard without pressing a single key. Ethan Whitmore checked the countdown clock mounted above the stage and smiled as the remaining time slipped away. 45 seconds. 44. 43. He folded his arms and leaned casually against the podium, enjoying the suspense as though the outcome had already been decided. "Do not worry," he said with an easy laugh that echoed across the speakers. "The clock moves faster when you are staring at impossible problems." A few people laughed again, more out of loyalty than genuine amusement. Several executives nodded confidently, while reporters prepared headlines celebrating another flawless demonstration of Ether Dynamics' industry-leading security platform. Only the engineers looked uncertain now. They noticed something the audience did not. Nia was not searching for weaknesses. She was reading the interface the way an experienced musician studies familiar sheet music. Her eyes moved across each authentication window with remarkable precision, never rushing, never second-guessing. She quietly asked the stage technician one simple question. "May I use the command console instead of the graphical interface?" The technician looked toward Ethan. Ethan shrugged without concern. "Of course, if it makes the show more interesting." Within seconds, the colorful dashboard disappeared, replaced by a clean black terminal window that stretched across the giant display behind her. A few people in the audience exchanged surprised glances. Most demonstrations relied on polished graphics because command lines intimidated non-technical viewers. Nia seemed completely at home. She typed a short sequence. Not quickly, not dramatically, calmly. Every keystroke carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly where each command belonged. The monitors above the stage displayed a familiar response. Authentication denied. A ripple of satisfaction spread through the crowd. Ethan smiled wider. "There it is," he said. "That is what enterprise-grade security looks like." Some investors applauded lightly. Nia did not react. She studied the response for less than 2 seconds before quietly entering another command. Then another. Still no visible success. Reporters lowered their cameras, assuming the challenge had already reached its predictable conclusion. Ethan glanced toward the audience and opened his hands. Sometimes experience teaches lessons that confidence alone cannot. His words sounded polite enough to earn approving smiles, but everyone understood the message beneath them. The intern had been given her chance. She had failed exactly as expected. Nia slowly lifted her eyes from the screen and looked directly at Ethan for the first time since stepping onto the stage. There was no frustration in her expression, no embarrassment, only curiosity. "May I ask one question?" she said. Ethan nodded confidently. "Go ahead. Has anyone here ever wondered why this platform still accepts legacy architecture requests that were supposedly retired 3 years ago?" The smile on Ethan's face remained, but it stopped growing. Several senior engineers looked toward one another with puzzled expressions. Legacy architecture had been removed years earlier according to every internal presentation and every investor report. The chief security officer quietly reached for his tablet and began reviewing system documentation. Somewhere inside the control booth, one engineer frowned at his monitor as if he had just noticed something that had never made sense before. For the first time that afternoon, the room was no longer waiting for an intern to fail. It was waiting to discover why she had asked a question that no one else had ever thought to ask. No one answered her question. The silence spread slowly across the auditorium, replacing the confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier. Ethan Whitmore glanced toward his chief security officer, expecting an immediate explanation, but the man was already scrolling through internal documentation with growing concern. Two senior engineers exchanged confused looks before one quietly whispered. The legacy authentication layer was supposed to be removed during the Phoenix migration. Another engineer shook his head. That is what the documentation says. Nia lowered her eyes to the keyboard once more. Documentation can be rewritten, she said calmly. Architecture remembers everything. The words landed differently. They were not spoken to impress anyone. They sounded like someone recalling an old memory. She entered another series of commands with steady hands, pausing only briefly between each line as if she already knew what every response would be before it appeared. The terminal remained quiet for several seconds. Then, one by one, new lines began appearing across the massive screen. Hidden services, archived modules, dormant authentication paths that no public demonstration had ever displayed before. Murmurs swept through the audience. Ethan's smile faded just enough for the cameras to notice. He stepped closer to the monitor, reading every line with narrowed eyes. "Those modules are inactive," one engineer said from the control booth, trying to reassure everyone. Another voice answered almost immediately. "Inactive does not always mean inaccessible." The room grew even quieter. Investors leaned forward. Journalists stopped typing and simply watched. Nia never looked at the audience. She continued, reading the system responses as though reconnecting with an old conversation interrupted years ago. Another command appeared on the screen. This time, the response was different. A hidden administrative interface silently opened beneath the primary security layer. It was not forced open. It did not trigger alarms. It responded as though it had been waiting for the correct request all along. Gasps echoed through the hall. Several security monitors flashed yellow instead of red. There was no breach warning, no emergency notification, only a quiet acknowledgement that an authorized legacy pathway had been recognized. Ethan immediately turned toward his security team. Who approved that access? Nobody answered. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards inside the control booth, but every search returned the same impossible result. The pathway existed. It had always existed. Yet no one currently employed by Ether Dynamics could explain why. Nia finally rested her hands beside the keyboard. "I did not hack your platform," she said softly. "I asked it to remember something everyone else forgot." The giant display shifted again. Instead of encrypted status reports, a small system banner appeared near the top of the screen. Legacy environment verified. Original architecture profile located. Even before anyone processed the message, another line appeared beneath it automatically. Loading historical configuration. Ethan stared at the display without blinking. His confident posture slowly disappeared, replaced by the expression of a man seeing his own company through unfamiliar eyes. Around the auditorium, engineers abandoned their conversations and opened archived design records. Some searched internal repositories. Others compared timestamps from forgotten backups. Every answer seemed to raise another question. How could an intern know about infrastructure that even senior architects no longer discussed? Why did the system respond to her commands without resistance? Why had no security audit ever documented this hidden environment? Nia looked quietly at the glowing server rack behind the glass wall. The lights reflected across her face, and for the first time that afternoon, they no longer looked unfamiliar. They looked like something she had once helped bring to life. The words on the giant screen refused to disappear. Original architecture profile located. Every person in the auditorium read them again, hoping they meant something simpler than they appeared to mean. Instead, the system quietly continued its own process without waiting for permission. A progress indicator slowly reached 100% before another notification faded into view. Historical developer metadata restored. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The room that had been filled with confident conversations only minutes earlier now sounded like a library after closing time. Ethan Whitmore stepped closer to the display until the glow from the screen reflected across his face. "Pull the historical records," he said to the control booth, his voice no longer carrying the effortless confidence that had defined the afternoon. Everything. His security team immediately began searching archived repositories, backup servers, and version histories that had not been opened in years. The chief security officer frowned as one search after another produced the same unexpected result. Old files that should have been erased were still there. Early development logs, prototype documentation, initial architecture diagrams. They had simply been buried beneath years of updates. One senior engineer suddenly stopped typing. His eyes widened as he stared at an old repository timestamp. "I found something," he whispered. His voice carried farther than he intended because the room had become completely silent. Every nearby monitor switched to the same archive. A development log dated exactly 3 years earlier appeared on the giant display. The first commit listed only one primary contributor, Nia Brooks. Several people blinked, convinced they had misread the name. Ethan stared at the screen without moving. Someone quietly refreshed the archive. The name remained. Another repository opened automatically. Again, the same contributor. Another design document. The same signature appeared inside the original system notes. Initial security framework designed by Nia Brooks. A reporter slowly lowered her camera. An investor removed his glasses and leaned closer. The expressions around the auditorium shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Ethan looked toward Nia for the first time not as an intern, but as someone standing in the middle of a mystery he no longer understood. "That cannot be right," one executive said quietly. "She has only been here for 3 months. Nia answered without pride and without anger. "I came back 3 months ago." Her calm voice echoed gently through the hall. "I was here long before that." The statement settled over the audience like a sudden change in weather. Memories began surfacing among a handful of longtime employees. Someone remembered a university partnership several years earlier. Another engineer recalled an exceptionally talented student working late during the company's earliest artificial intelligence security project. Nobody remembered what happened after that. The project had grown. The company had expanded. Teams changed. Managers left. New executives arrived. Somewhere along the way, one brilliant young developer had quietly disappeared from everyone's memory while her work continued powering one of the most celebrated cybersecurity platforms in the country. Ethan slowly turned back toward the enormous screen. His reflection stood beside the restored developer records, making the contrast impossible to ignore. The system had not identified an intruder. It had recognized its original architect. Every command Nia entered had not broken security. They had followed the language the platform itself had been taught to trust from the very beginning. And for the first time since stepping onto the stage that afternoon, Ethan Whitmore realized the woman everyone had dismissed as an inexperienced intern had never been trying to prove she belonged there. The system had already answered that question before anyone else in the room even thought to ask it. For a long moment, Ethan Whitmore said nothing. The silence carried more weight than any speech he had delivered that afternoon. The bright stage lights still illuminated the polished logo of Ether Dynamics behind him, but the confidence that had once filled the platform had quietly slipped away. Every camera remained fixed on him, waiting for an explanation that even he did not have. Across the control booth, engineers continued opening archive after archive. Each forgotten file seemed to unlock another piece of a story no one realized had been erased. The oldest project folders contain meeting notes from the company's university innovation partnership, attendance lists, prototype evaluations, internal design reviews. Buried among hundreds of pages appeared a familiar name again and again. Nia Brooks. Not as an intern, not as an assistant, as lead student research developer. The discovery spread across the engineering team in stunned whispers. One veteran architect adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the monitor. "I remember her," he said quietly. "She solved the adaptive authentication conflict before any of us could." Another engineer slowly nodded. "She was the one who proposed the self-learning trust layer. We thought it was years ahead of its time." Ethan turned sharply toward them. "Why have I never heard any of this?" No one answered immediately. Finally, an older project manager spoke with visible hesitation. "Because the project changed after the acquisition." His voice remained steady, but every word sounded heavier than the last. The research team was dissolved. Leadership shifted. Documentation was consolidated. Student contributors were removed from the public release files because the legal department wanted a cleaner ownership structure before investors came in. The auditorium fell completely still. Those words explained far more than anyone expected. They did not accuse anyone directly. They simply described decisions that had quietly buried the work of people whose names no longer appeared in the company's public history. Nia listened without interrupting. She had heard similar explanations before. Budget restructuring, corporate transition, documentation standardization. Different words that somehow always reached the same destination. Her work survived. Her name did not. Ethan slowly walked toward the center of the stage until he stood only a few feet away from her. For the first time that afternoon, he was no longer looking down at an inexperienced intern. He was looking at someone whose fingerprints still existed inside the foundation of the platform that had helped build his company's reputation. "If you built the original framework," he asked quietly, "why did you leave?" Nia took a slow breath before answering. "I did not leave because I stopped believing in the project." Her voice remained calm enough that every microphone captured each word with perfect clarity. "I left because after my faculty mentor passed away unexpectedly, there was nobody left who knew what I had actually contributed. The project moved forward. The company grew. I finished school, found contract work, and kept building other systems. I never came back to prove anyone wrong. I came back because I wanted to see whether the architecture I believed in was still alive." She looked briefly toward the glowing server rack before returning her eyes to Ethan. Today it answered before anyone else did. Around the auditorium, no one reached for applause. No one searched for another joke. The only sound came from the quiet hum of servers continuing to run code written years earlier by a young developer whose greatest achievement had remained hidden in plain sight until the system itself finally remembered the truth. No one announced the end of the demonstration, yet the event had already become something entirely different. The challenge that was supposed to celebrate an unbreakable security platform transformed into a room full of people confronting a forgotten truth. Then the first notification appeared. A reporter sitting near the front row uploaded a 30-second clip showing the system restoring its original developer records. Within minutes, another journalist posted a close-up image of the giant screen displaying Nia Brooks as the original architecture contributor. Phones vibrated across the auditorium almost simultaneously. Headlines began appearing before anyone even left their seats. Technology bloggers questioned the company's development history. Software engineers on professional forums started comparing archived conference papers with the newly revealed repository records. Former interns searched old university newsletters. Alumni groups reopened forgotten project photos. The internet was doing what no corporate archive had managed to do for 3 years. It was remembering. Inside the control booth, engineers kept digging through backup servers with growing urgency. Every restored document strengthened the same conclusion. The earliest adaptive authentication model, the trust validation engine, the behavioral learning framework. Nia's fingerprints were everywhere. Not metaphorically, literally. Her developer identification appeared inside thousands of archived commits that had never been deleted, only hidden beneath years of reorganized repositories. Ethan Whitmore watched the growing wave of discoveries unfold on monitors surrounding the stage. His communications director approached quietly and whispered that the company's public relations team had already received dozens of media requests asking for clarification. Investors wanted answers. Journalists wanted interviews. Employees wanted context. Yet Ethan noticed something that mattered even more. His own engineers were no longer looking at Nia with curiosity. They were looking at her with respect. One after another, they approached the stage, not to challenge her, but to ask thoughtful technical questions about decisions she had made years earlier. Nia answered every question with remarkable patience. She explained why the adaptive trust layer learned user behavior instead of relying solely on passwords. She described how redundant authentication paths protected legitimate users during unexpected infrastructure failures. She even smiled gently when one young engineer admitted that he had unknowingly spent 6 months improving code she originally designed. There was no trace of bitterness in her voice, only genuine enthusiasm for technology that continued helping people long after its creator had been forgotten. Watching from the edge of the stage, Ethan realized something uncomfortable. Leadership was not simply about building successful companies. It was also about protecting the people whose ideas built those companies in the first place. Somewhere along the path toward rapid growth, acquisitions, funding rounds, and public recognition, someone had become invisible while her work remained celebrated every single day. The irony settled heavily across the room. The platform had remembered its architect more faithfully than the organization built around it. A notification suddenly appeared on the large confidence monitor reserved for executive staff. The livestream audience had passed 5 million viewers. Comments poured in faster than moderators could read them. Software developers from around the country shared screenshots of old academic competitions where Nia's name had once appeared. Former professors posted photographs of university research showcases. A retired faculty advisor uploaded an article praising a gifted student whose security framework had been described as years ahead of industry standards. Every new post filled another missing piece of the story. Without raising her voice, without arguing, and without trying to embarrass anyone, Nia Brooks had done something far more powerful than winning a public challenge. She had reminded an entire industry that brilliant ideas do not lose their value simply because the world forgets the name of the person who created them. The conference schedule quietly disappeared from every screen inside the auditorium. Sessions were postponed. Product demonstrations were delayed. Investors remained in their seats instead of leaving for private meetings because everyone understood they were witnessing something far more valuable than another technology presentation. Ethan Whitmore slowly returned to the center of the stage and looked across the thousands of faces watching him. The confidence that had once sounded effortless was now replaced by careful honesty. He picked up the microphone, paused for several seconds, and then lowered it again before speaking. Some moments deserved more thought than polished words. Finally, he looked directly at Nia Brooks. "I promised $500,000 to anyone who could defeat our security platform," he said quietly. "You did something much greater. You reminded us who gave this platform its first heartbeat." The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody applauded. Ethan turned toward the executive team seated in the front row. "Bring the legal department to the stage. Right now." Several executives looked surprised, but no one questioned the instruction. Within minutes, the company's chief legal officer and chief financial officer joined him under the bright lights. Cameras followed every step. Livestream viewers climbed even higher as news organizations began broadcasting the event live across the country. Ethan accepted a digital tablet from his legal counsel before handing it directly to Nia. "This is not a publicity gesture," he said. "This is the beginning of correcting a record that should never have been lost." The document displayed on the screen outlined immediate recognition of her original architectural contributions, restoration of her authorship within the company's historical engineering archives, and the creation of a permanent public technical record acknowledging her role in designing the foundational security framework. Nia quietly read every page before looking back at Ethan. She did not rush to sign. Instead, she asked one simple question. Will every engineer whose work disappeared during those early years be reviewed the same way? The question surprised everyone. She could have focused only on herself. Instead, she thought about people whose names might also have quietly faded into forgotten folders and archived databases. Ethan nodded without hesitation. Every project, every contributor, every archived record. The answer carried through the auditorium with remarkable clarity. The engineering team exchanged approving glances. Several longtime employees smiled for the first time all afternoon. They understood that the conversation had become larger than one person. It had become about integrity. Ethan then turned toward the production crew. Update the display. A technician pressed a few keys. The massive screen behind the stage slowly faded from the company logo to a clean white background. One line of text appeared. Original security architecture. Beneath it, another line gradually materialized. Lead student research developer, Nia Brooks. No special effects. No dramatic music. Just the truth displayed in letters large enough for every person in the building to read. The audience rose to its feet almost instinctively. The applause began quietly before growing into something warm, genuine, and unforced. Nia stood motionless for a moment, looking not at the crowd but at the name on the screen. 3 years earlier, it had disappeared without ceremony. Today, it returned without anyone being able to deny it. Ethan extended his hand. This time there was no challenge, no performance, and no audience waiting for someone to fail. There was only one leader acknowledging another professional whose ideas had quietly strengthened an entire company long before either of them realized they would one day meet again under the brightest lights in Silicon Valley. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling inside the auditorium remained. It was not the excitement that usually followed a successful product launch. It was quieter than that, deeper than that. People who had arrived expecting to witness another display of corporate brilliance were leaving with something they had not planned to carry home. Perspective. Engineers gathered around the restored project archives, reading comments written years earlier by a young developer whose ideas had quietly outlived forgotten meetings, changing executives, and polished marketing campaigns. Investors who normally spoke only about quarterly growth now found themselves discussing integrity, mentorship, and the responsibility that came with innovation. Journalists who had prepared headlines celebrating an impossible security challenge rewrote every article before publishing. The story was no longer about whether a platform could be broken. It was about what happens when the truth patiently waits for the world to catch up. Ethan Whitmore remained on the stage long after most executives would have disappeared behind closed doors. He watched employees introduce themselves to Nia Brooks, not because she had embarrassed anyone, but because they genuinely wanted to learn from her. Some thanked her for the architecture they had unknowingly built upon. Others apologized for assumptions they had never realized they were making. Nia greeted every conversation with the same quiet humility she had carried since walking into the auditorium that morning. Recognition had finally found her, but it had not changed her. It simply returned something that had always belonged to her. Before leaving the stage, Ethan asked if she would consider helping lead the next generation of security research at Ether Dynamics. Nia smiled politely before answering. Titles matter less than culture. If people are encouraged to ask questions without being dismissed, remarkable ideas will never have to wait 3 years to be recognized. Ethan nodded slowly because he understood exactly what she meant. The greatest mistake made that day had not been underestimating technical skill. It had been assuming that talent always arrives wearing the title everyone expects. Several weeks later, the company announced a permanent engineering fellowship honoring student innovators whose contributions might otherwise go unnoticed. Every archive project entered an independent historical review so that forgotten contributors could receive proper recognition. Universities across the country shared Nia's story with engineering students beginning their own careers, reminding them that real innovation is measured not only by patents or profits, but by the courage to keep creating even when no one is watching. The original developer record remained displayed inside Ether Dynamics headquarters, not as a reminder of corporate embarrassment, but as a promise to every future engineer who walked through its doors. Visitors often stopped to read the name before entering the research laboratories. Many never knew the full story, but they understood the lesson. Nia Brooks never came to the conference searching for applause. She never demanded revenge. She never tried to humiliate the man who laughed when she first raised her hand. She simply allowed the truth to speak through the work she had created years before. In the end, the system remembered what people had forgotten. Respect arrived where recognition had once been missing. And everyone who witnessed that remarkable afternoon left understanding one simple truth. Power can command attention for a moment. Wealth can fill an auditorium. But character, humility, and genuine brilliance leave a legacy that no archive should ever erase.